again, sorry that it is so dark. So I'm going to ask you a couple questions about the readings. You're probably pretty used to this by now. And then I'm going to do a very short closing lecture. So the first thing I'd like you to do is just give me a quick summary of flights of the mind. Okay. So I'm going to ask you a few discussion questions about each of the readings. There are a lot of ways to answer this. I'm not looking for one specific answer. I just want you to show me that you understand what I'm asking. So in Flight of the Mind, how did Kay's positionality increase her likelihood of obtaining help for her illness? Okay, so for some examples, she had money, she had socioeconomic status, and she had a high economic capital. She had social capital, so having her brother to help her, having her brother to write her checks, for example. She was able to get help because she had people in her life that would help her. She's a professional, again, going with the occupational prestige, high SES. Her job was self-directed. So there was that level where if she needed to take time off, they would trust that she'll still get her work done. She's in a psychiatric field, a psychological field, so they're extra understanding. And she's a woman, so she's more likely to seek help. There are other examples than that, but those are just a couple of them. But if you had a different answer, that's okay too. And so I'm going to ask you a few questions about concepts. Okay, right. So the reliance on lithium is an example of medicalization. Some examples of deviance are her provocative dress, the excessive makeup she was wearing, not respecting norms of when to end a conversation, outrageous spending, lack of control over her condition. Those are all some examples. And of course, there were more than that. And then the other answer, so once there's the label of bipolar, she started interpreting, all of her symptoms in that way, and that's labeling theory. Okay, wasted. Give me a short summary of wasted. And I'm going to ask you a few discussion questions and we'll do something similar. So I have scars all over my body that were not there in 1993, which means some sadness came alive as my body did. So this is totally opinion-based, A few sentences is fine. Just show me you're engaging. Were you surprised to hear Maria talk about self-harm as an example of progress? Did that bring anything up for you? All right, I'm going to show you a quick video. I want to read you this quote first, and I'll ask you again. The next question is also totally opinion-based. Just want you to engage. So, quote, women use their obsession with weight and food as a point of connection with one another. Instead of talking about why we use food and weight control as a means of handling emotional stress, we talk ad nauseum about the fact that we don't like our bodies. So I'm going to show you a clip. I don't know, this might be too old. Do you guys even know what Mean Girls is?
She's like a Martian.
I don't know. You guys might be too young and hip for this, but if you haven't seen Mean Girls, like, you should. It's good.
Of her. She's like a Martian. Oh, my hips are huge. Oh, I hate my calves. Guys from our halters. I've got man shoulders.
I used to think there was just fat and skinny. Apparently, there's a lot of things that can be wrong on your body.
My hairline is so weird. And pores are huge. I know that sucks. I have really bad breath in the morning. Yeah.
Okay, so why do I show you that? This is also an example of the cost of caring, for example. And so caring about your female friends sometimes can look like putting yourself down because, she's feeling a bit bloated and I'm feeling like I'm not bloated today. But if I say it in response to her saying she's bloated, well, that sucks for you. I am bloated in 2 weeks. That's going to hurt her feelings. And so this is an example of the cost of caring. And so again, this is an opinion-based question. If you are a woman, does this seem true to you, this experience that's talked about in Wasted? And how do you navigate that? If you're not a woman, if you're a man or if you're an NB, or if you're a woman some days, but today you don't feel like answering like a woman, however you want to answer it, I'm not here to tell you which question to answer as long as you answer one of them. So if you're not a woman or you're not feeling like a woman today, does this seem believable? Is there a man equivalent or an NB equivalent to this unhealthy bonding mechanism, or do you think that it's just a woman thing? And then Why might movement toward recovery feel like a terrifying loss of self? Just a sentence or two. And then finally, similar to how we did with the last one, I'm going to ask you some questions about the concepts. And so, okay, when I asked you about examples of doing gender, so starving, obsessing over weight, having sex with strangers as a replacement for self-esteem, these are all examples of things that are more stereotypically feminine behaviors. So that's an example of doing gender. You could have had other ones, that's fine as well. The cost of caring shows up in being drained around other women who are venting about their bodies. Women being more likely to quote unquote turn on themselves is an example of an internalizing disorder over or internalizing symptoms over externalizing symptoms. And so the fact that we have such an increase, or the fact that eating disorders is relatively new, but we have so many people who have them relative to the rest of the world, that's an example of diagnostic creation. Before a certain time, eating disorders weren't even considered to be real. And then finally, give me a brief summary of to tell or not to tell. And then I'm going to ask you these. And so the point of this study was on how the mentally ill decide whether to tell, when to tell, how much to tell employers and coworkers about their own mental illnesses. And so out of 20 people who were interviewed for this study, only 4 of them had used the Americans with Disabilities Act for formal protection. So you guys know, Rutgers has a disability office. There are policies set in place for people to prevent or curtail discrimination against people who are mentally ill. It's the Americans with Disabilities Act. However, most people who have a mental illness do not ever use this. I'll be honest with you guys. I have I've told you before, I haven't hidden it. I know I sometimes people with mental illnesses, I don't always say we people with mental illnesses, but when it makes sense to bring it up, I do. I'm a person who has mental illnesses. I have a variety of health issues, and mental issues are some of the ones that I suffer from. I have had difficulties with school, with work, interpersonal difficulties. My mental illnesses have affected every single part of my life. If I had used the Americans with Disabilities Act, that probably helped me sometimes. I could say, well, this is why I acted that way. This is why I behaved that way. And I, can't get fired because of it, and not saying that I would ever use my mental illness as a lie or an excuse, but I'm saying that there are times whenever my symptoms have impeded my ability to work effectively. And if I had used the Americans with Disabilities Act, maybe I would have been judged less, for example. However, most people never use this. Why? And so one concern is that they can't get it. Why go through all of the work, having your therapist sign off on it, going through your insurance? Why go through all the work if it's not even going to work and you won't even get it? Because you have to apply for it. You can't just say, well, I'm feeling mighty disabled today. Let me get that ADA. No, you have to apply for it and jump through hoops. And so a lot of people don't want to have to do all that. But also, once you disclose, now people know. And again, what are we talking about today? Stigma. And so the ways that there were 3 types of disclosure strategies that were talked about and to tell or not to tell. One was disclosing your mental illness to your coworkers and employer fully and early. The other is revealing your mental illness only partially and selectively, so picking certain people. And the third is not disclosing at all. And so if we think of the full and early, so basically day 1, look, I'm borderline. This is how I act sometimes. That'd be full and early. On day 1, maybe even in the interview, you tell them, probably not, but maybe. So what's the cost of telling everybody at your job fully and early on that you have a mental illness? What's the benefit? Okay, partial and selective. So this is you tell some people if you feel like you need to. Maybe you tell your work wife, but you don't tell your boss. So you're selective about who you tell, and you never tell everything. What's the cost of that? What's the benefit of that? And then finally, non-disclosure. You ain't telling nobody nothing. You don't care what happens. You don't care if you get caught talking to yourself in the middle of the hallway. You'll say you had a bad tuna sandwich before you tell them that you have schizophrenia. So what's the cost of non-disclosure? And then what's a benefit? Okay, sure, you did great. So here are some examples. Telling everybody up front, fully and early, a cost is you can't take it back. Everybody knows the stigma's there and you could be discriminated against. Yes, there is the ADA Act that's supposed to prevent discrimination, but there's also laws about racial discrimination and gender discrimination. And we know it still happens. And so, yes, this act is supposed to decrease discrimination, but let's be honest, it's still going to happen. And once you tell people, you can't control how they're going to act to you. Your employer might be a bit more, walking on eggshells, but your coworkers, they might not be as understanding. A benefit, though, is you can use the American with Disabilities Act. You can't be outed because you already outed yourself, so you have complete control over who knows. And if you do have some quote unquote abnormal behavior, well, now there's context. Now people understand why you're talking to yourself, why you're in a bad mood, why you have cuts on your arm, for example. Partial and selective. A cost of this, of only telling certain people, you kind of sacrifice the real me. Not everybody knows who you are. You could still be outed. You might be accused of faking because you're only telling some people. Maybe you're only telling people when it seems like it's advantageous to you. You can still experience stigma and discrimination. The benefit then is that you have more control and you can use it to your advantage. You can be strategic. And then finally, non-disclosure. The cost, again, is sacrificing that real me. You can't use the American with Disabilities Act. There's no leeway for symptoms. So if you're not going to tell anybody that you have dissociative identity disorder, then you better probably not share your symptoms either. It's like if you're never going to tell anybody, you have to be very careful about the symptoms you let slip. And you might be outed. If somebody observes you doing something that they took a psych course and they know that you have OCD based off of their psych course they took, well, now they can out you. The benefit of non-disclosure is people won't know that your symptoms are symptoms most of the time, and you can avoid stigma and you can avoid some types of discrimination. So I want you guys to imagine that you're an employer and you're interviewing candidates for a prospective position working with the public. You have narrowed your choices to 2 equally qualified candidates. As part of collecting background info, you learn that one of them was once hospitalized for mental illness, specifically schizophrenia. 1, should that knowledge, should in an ideal world, affect your hiring decision? And in reality, and we have enough report that you're going to be honest with me, right? You'll be honest with me. Do you think it would affect your decision? Be honest. And if you're not comfortable being honest, then tell me why that is. Totally opinion-based. No wrong answers here. All right. And then finally, we'll move on to our moving on section after this. I'm going to read you this, and then I just want you to tell me what type of discrimination this is. So quote, this is from the Tell or Not to Tell. I would say you need to be realistic about the dangers of disclosure. I don't think I would have gotten either one of my jobs if I had been out as mentally ill for a couple of reasons. 1, because the danger of very real discrimination on their part. Just without any other knowledge of me, just knowing the label, they might say, let's get somebody else. Or they might treat me in a certain way because of their own fears. That would lead me to leave those jobs. Or my disclosure would create a dynamic in me where I would be so nervous and feel so vulnerable that I would try to create a self-fulfilling prophecy. I would make a simple mistake. I overreact with fear and paranoia. They notice my overreaction and then they have a reaction. And then I notice their reaction to my reaction, and it just spirals. Another quote, I think part of what kept me in this shell was feeling the stigma, like no one would accept me, that I would be shunned even more. And so each of these that I highlighted, and it's okay if you were reading this and you didn't catch it. That's literally what I'm here for, is combining your readings together. And so whenever it's the idea of let's get somebody else, if there is an employer who says, oh, they have schizophrenia, let's hire somebody else, what kind of discrimination is that? Okay, so if they treat you differently but it's not different enough that you can point it out unless you observe interactions over time. What kind of discrimination is that? And then finally, feeling that you disclosing would create a stigma, and you're feeling a stigma in yourself. No one's really treating you poorly, but you expect to be treated poorly. What kind of discrimination is that? All right, great job. Finally, we're just going to close up. I've had a wonderful semester. Let's bang this out. All right, critical reflections and future directions for sociological research. So you do have to finish watching the lecture, but you can kind of just sit back for this one. I'm going to move through it pretty quickly because I really just want to give you an overview. This is like a wrap-up lecture. So the history of mental health policy in the US can be divided into 3 periods. 1, the development of the asylum as a primary mode of mental health treatment, basically marked by increasing control over the lives of people with mental illness. Next, deinstitutionalization and the move to community-based care, which is marked by the recognition of the rights of people having mental illness, which partially came from Goffman's writing on stigma or the asylum. And then finally, where we are here today is the recovery as the guiding vision. So we're very recovery focused today. And to us, it's obvious, of course it's about wellness, but no, historically, recovery wasn't even assumed to be possible through most of history. And so the fact that mental health policy today is based on recovery, that's actually new, and it's only been the past couple of decades. So the beginning, 17th century to the 1940s, development of the state asylum. And so increasing social control and institutional care. The family was the primary role or provider of mental health care at this time. And as the population increased, then we began to move people into asylums because there just wasn't enough. Families had to work and they couldn't take care of all of their sick loved ones anymore. And so the population boom is part of what led to the increase in the asylum. The asylum became the primary setting, and then the asylum population also boomed. So this is part of this is that people who were older, the elderly, were being put in asylums, not because they had schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, but because at this time, age-related mental decline, so just Alzheimer's, dementia, just losing your marbles a little bit, getting a little bit silly in your old age. They put them in an asylum for that. And so that's a whole consistent part of the population that's just going into the asylum. Vitamin A deficiency, people weren't taking their vitamins at this time. That put them in the asylum. Tertiary syphilis. Once it gets to the tertiary stage, syphilis destroys your brain. They put them in the asylum. And so in this period, we saw a 240% increase in asylum, and a number of these supported eugenics, which basically meant that they didn't even want people in the asylums to reproduce, and they actually sterilized a ton of people. Well, that's not great, right? So we moved to deinstitutionalization. This is about patient rights through Goffman's asylum, conscientious objectors, various legal cases. People started to realize these asylums are not safe. The staff isn't necessarily kind, the conditions aren't healthy. And so this concern about patient health is why we moved away from the institution. And so at first we had this happening at about 1.5% per year. After the first 10 years of this, we're now seeing about 10% per year of deinstitutionalization. Where did they go from the institutions? They went to the community. However, there was no actual plan. There was no plan that really came. It was just, yeah, send them back to the community, but to do what? And so it then became on the onus of the state to take care of mentally ill people, even though they were in the community. Because, and the thing is why this doesn't really work, the policies assumed that, people would have a home in the community. However, most patients who were released didn't have any home to go to. They didn't have anyone to take care of them like 17th century. And so a lot of people who were taken out of asylums because of deinstitutionalization ended up in jail, homeless, or long-term facilities because there was no plan for them. Because the plan was, oh, well, we could just let them out and they can go back home. But a lot of them didn't have homes. Now, thankfully, here we are, and I say thankfully because I am just like a product of my time. 1990 is the present. Sorry about that. The central focus is on recovery. Recovery in psychiatry is biomedical and based on outcome. Recovery in policy is based on consumer-centered, holistic, being process-oriented. And so the lack of guidance around what recovery means has contributed to barriers. And so there are not common recovery definitions. And so whenever you guys, and we'll talk about it in a second, you read depressives in the lounge, it's not clear what recovery looks like. Recovery looks different for everybody. And so we could probably all agree that, you know, the belief that people who are mentally ill can get better is a good thing. However, if we don't have a clear consensus on what better means, how do we judge that and how do we strive towards that? And if we don't know what recovery means, then how do we have sufficient programs, treatments, and practices? And so we're still a really, really long way away from having a recovery-oriented mental health care system. Having better access also isn't going to fix it if the services we have access to are ineffective or of low quality. And so our final conclusion slide, and again, you still have depressives in the lounge. There's going to be one more reading for us to talk about, but I'm going to make it quick. So we have moved from a time when people with mental illnesses were taken care of in the community to a time where they were put in institutions, to a point where they're back in the community with a large number in institutions. And so even though I just traced out these 3 time periods and now it's about recovery, we kind of went backwards in the sense that we're still putting people in the institutions, and a lot of them are in the community homeless because they had nowhere to go. Mental health treatment is still largely out of reach for many people, such as undocumented immigrants, poor people, rural people, and minors. And sociologists have gratefully or thankfully contributed to interdisciplinary research, but we need to learn more specifically about the social stratification of recovery. All right. And finally, here we go. I'm going to ask you, this is, again, just your own opinion. So towards the end of this piece, Depressives in the Lounge, Sharon quotes a support group member who says that the stigma attached to her mental illness creates more difficulties than the illness itself. Do you think this is dramatic? And if it's not dramatic, what do you think this says about our society's treatment of the mentally ill? Completely opinion-based. 2 people completed suicide in this story. Both of the suicides were mentioned fairly casually and without warning. Was it hard to read about these suicides so casually? And now I want you to think, what do you think would happen if we discussed suicide openly and casually? Do you think it would be a bad thing to be more casual about suicide? Or do you think it could be helpful in some ways? And then finally, again, totally opinion-based, this is my last one. Sharon talks with Annette about hospitalization. Annette explains that she comes to group because if she's ever hospitalized again, she wants to make sure a lot of people visit her. She says, I'm networking. Sharon decides, well, if she's hospitalized again, she also wants to have friends and family get to visit. So, is it helpful to plan for hospitalization in this way? Was it odd for you to read about people who are finding positives in hospitalization? And do you think this is a defeatist mindset, or is there some good that comes from this? Okay, that's all I have for you guys. Thank you so much for being great this semester. Thank you for your patience. Between the air quality and just various health issues and life things going on, it was a hectic semester for me. I tried my best to keep up with everything, and you guys were extremely patient. I've tried my best to be generous with grading. I've given extensions to everybody who has asked. I've done everything I can really to try to be accommodating because you guys have been so great with me. So I apologize if any of my health issues and the consequences of them have made this hard for you. But I really appreciate you guys, and I had a good time this semester, and hopefully I get to meet some of you in person. This is no way to teach. This is no way to learn. I did my best, but if you ever have a chance to take an in-person class with me, please do it because I have a ton of fun in person. So tomorrow you have your exam from 8 to 5. I'm giving you 2 hours instead of 1, just because of kindness. You have a 10-minute video presentation on 2 chapters due tomorrow. The assignment sheet's online. Again, only 10 minutes. That's 5 minutes per chapter. It doesn't have to be hard. And Wednesday, so I have 48 business hours to submit grades. The semester ends tomorrow. I would like to get grades submitted on Monday. I have until Wednesday. If you have not submitted your work, get it into me as soon as possible. I will still grade it. But after the next couple of days, I simply will not have the time to do so. If you're missing a lot of assignments and you would like to talk seriously about a realistic and complete grade, reach out to me about that. Okay, if you guys need anything at all, please feel free to let me know. I had a wonderful time.